Hello, everyone. Welcome to YASCP, your African Supply Chain Podcast. I'm your host, Stella Jaqueta. In this podcast, we discuss various topics that affect my beautiful, your beautiful, uncomplicated African supply chains. And the title of this episode is The Woes and Wonders of African Trade Corridor. And it's a topic that I've been wanting to do the longest. And I just couldn't find the right person until I heard Barbara Mommen speak at the SAPES conference back in June down in Cape Town in South Africa. And let me tell you why I think Barbara is just the perfect person for this topic. Barbara Mommen has worked extensively in both public and private sectors in various capacities over the past 30 years. Since 2006, she has worked in trade, transport, and development with 5 years as COO and then 8 as CEO of the Maputo Corridor Logistics Initiative, has a corridor management institution for the trade and transport corridor for Mozambique, Eswatini, and South Africa. She is a trade and transport corridor specialist focusing on regional integration and regional economic development issues and enabling the critical link between policy and implementation. She has extensive experience in process facilitation and stakeholder engagement and is passionate about collaboration across the public and private sectors to see Africa's economic potential realized. So, as you guys heard, for this topic, she's a real expert when it comes to African trade corridors. So, Barbara, welcome to YASCP. And how are you doing, Barbara?
Stella, thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for having me. I feel very honored, I must say. I don't feel like an expert. I learn something new every single day about the work I do. So it's a bit scary to be called an expert. Yeah. But thank you so much for having me.
Welcome. So when it comes, and I think with African trade, it's always a learning curve. Every day there's something new that you can learn. So yeah. But when it comes to Africa, for me, you are an expert.
Oh, thank you. Very honored. Thank you so much, Stella.
So just to get started, Barbara, what are the major African trade corridors? For someone who has never heard, is it a hallway corridor? Is it like a belt? Like, can you explain to us, like, what is a corridor, first of all, a trade corridor, and which one are the major African trade corridors?
Okay, so a trade corridor is really a sort of collection of transport infrastructure that carries trade across borders to a port. And normally a corridor is named after the port that is the main servicing port for that collection of infrastructure. So there are a number of really big corridors in Africa. Let's start in West Africa with the Abidjan-Lagos corridor. Covers a significant length, I think 1,500 or more kilometers from start to Lagos. And then the Addis to Djibouti corridor. I know that it's not a formally established corridor, but it's functioning as a corridor. And then we have several corridors in Central and Eastern Africa. The key ones, I would say, are the Northern Corridor, which goes from the port of Mombasa to South Sudan through those six countries, and then also the Central Corridor, which is from the port of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania through to Rwanda, Burundi, and I think that's it. And then major corridors in Southern Africa, obviously the North-South Corridor, which is from the port of Durban to Lubumbashi in Southern Congo, DRC. Then obviously the Maputo Corridor, which stretches from the hinterland of South Africa, Gauteng, Johannesburg, and through the mining facilities on the Highveld through to the port of Maputo, and also including Eswatini. And then we have the Trans-Kalahari Corridor, which is a model of government cooperation between Botswana, South Africa, and Namibia. And that runs from Johannesburg through Botswana and into Namibia to the port of Walvis Bay. And then I think significantly the Walvis Bay corridor, which includes the Trans-Kanani, it includes the corridors that run into Zambia and up through to DRC as well from Walvis Bay. And then the newest one is the Lobito Corridor, which is obviously in Angola into the Central African region. So very exciting development. They've been formalized and up and running, which is great to hear.
Yeah. And Barbara, taking it down to the southern region, you have the northern, you have the south, they have the Trans-Kalahari and the Lobito, the new one, Lobito Corridor. So in this one, what are the major woes that you've found and challenges that you've seen during your consultancy and your work? What are the major trade corridors? Because I'm in Mozambique, and people sometimes it's so easy to complain about trade. So, but we don't understand the intricacies that go about it. So can you explain to us what are the major challenges and woes that you've found?
Okay, so I think, from working with colleagues who've managed corridor institutions, certainly in Southern Africa and Central and Eastern Africa, we found one of the biggest common factors is the border crossing challenges. And despite huge efforts by governments, by private sector, by the customs authorities, we are still seeing significant challenges at border crossings. And obviously one has to ask why that is. And I think it's different in different regions. We can't sort of put a blanket statement around this is the reason why. But I think what's very central to the issue around border crossing is the fact that quite a lot of the time, even though Africa has got significant experience in supposed one-stop border posts, which quite often aren't one-stop, they're two-stop anyway, we don't see the kind of information sharing and the cross-pollination of data, and particularly around customs and immigration, that should be there to facilitate trade and to get vehicles, international trade to work efficiently. So there has to be a greater focus on getting countries to talk to each other about those things. And I think it's a priority because it contributes a significant costs to the price of goods in Africa. And I always say, it shouldn't be like this, because this is the continent that can least afford to have the most expensive logistics cost in the world. And unfortunately, chaos at border posts feeds corruption. And obviously there is this perception, and probably, and rightly so, that Africa is terribly corrupt. Well, chaos feeds that perception. And honestly, I think that one of the issues is that there has to be significant political will. And where we've seen that work is definitely in East Africa. Mostly because I think there is a kind of homogeneity around the border crossing procedures. A lot of the time, they're part of the East African community. The ability of the organizations that have serviced those corridors, and particularly the Northern Corridor, to bring together stakeholders and to really focus on improving the capacity of borders to carry trade and to clear efficiently is certainly something that is followed very, with great interest by the governments on those corridors. I think we've lost significant focus. If we look at the Maputo Corridor, for example, we've lost significant focus in South Africa over the last 10 to 15 years, where we've had major political issues, which just really do take the focus away from international trade policy and foreign policy engagement. And I think our foreign policy has suffered as a result. And as a result of that, we've not, as South Africa, really managed to lead or to provide leadership in terms of bilateral engagement to ensure that you're promoting regional integration, that you're supporting international trade, that you're supporting the very values that are required and processes and procedures that should support efficient cross-border trade. Difficult question, but I think we have a long way to go, particularly in Southern Africa. And East Africa has the East African community has really enabled significant development in terms of cross-border trade efficiencies. I wouldn't say it's perfect because it's obviously something that is constantly changing. It's very dynamic. It's something that requires constant engagement of monitoring and evaluation. And those systems are in place. And I think what we see happening and unfolding on the Maputo Corridor as we speak is a significant gap in corridor management. And obviously having spent so many of my years in corridor management, I think that the role that corridor management institutions play is significant in promoting regional integration, in ensuring that engagement between public and private sector, and ensuring really accountability of role players. And unfortunately, we've lost that, and we have a huge gap. And that's something that needs to be looked at.
And thank you, Barbara. And as you were speaking about the integration and the different agreements that our countries actually have that are in place already, but it's a problem of implementation. But my question is, isn't this something that everybody knows? And how did this originate? Because since all of the Southern African countries have now gained independence, and I'm pretty sure there have been talks about it, meetings and memorandums signed. So many things happen. So why is this still prevailing up until today? We are in 2023, and why is this issue still prevailing in our societies? Why is it still prevailing, really?
Look, I think one has to look at the institutional arrangements in the region, and some of these are fairly complex. A lot of the SADC countries are all, well, not a lot, but there are SADC countries that are also members of the EAC and also of other regional economic communities, and COMESA. So there's that. But also, I think the shortcoming is really in capacitating the regional economic communities to do their job. So what's happened in SADC is that you have a secretariat that is hugely overworked, understaffed, under-resourced. And the biggest challenge we face, certainly in the SADC region, is the domestication of regional agreements. And quite often, I think what happens there is that what happens at regional level is not filtered sufficiently into the international sort of the national and cross-border kind of structures. So which is why I think the role of corridor management institutions is so important, because they're right at the interface of those regional agreements, and they can create the awareness, create the environment for the issues to be discussed, and where they fall short, they're able to engage with the relevant governments and pull them together. But there's also, where corridors are concerned, I think, and this is probably not a very popular position that I'm going to take, but I do think we need to ask ourselves the old question: if we continue to do what we've always done, how can we possibly expect different?
Exactly.
And I think the issue is around how we structure institutional arrangements. And certainly as far as corridors are concerned, governments sign the agreements to set up a corridor institution in SADC. And those memorandums are binding, but quite often they exclude, I think to a certain point, the ability and the participation of the private sector to bring in a perspective that government may miss. And it's not that's not an accusation, it's just a reality. Government finds it difficult to work with private sector finds it often quite difficult to work with government. So we've got to, in looking at future institutional arrangements, try to breach that divide. What we've also seen, so it's a fairly complex issue, is that countries have, on account of economic challenges, become slightly more protectionist, despite the AfCFTA push for,
integration,
free trade area and integration. What we are seeing is countries somewhat reluctant to let go of certain duties on certain goods. But I think that we are certainly moving in the right direction. But what I've seen, certainly as I have worked in the consulting field, is that private sector and government can work very effectively together, provided private sector's able to define itself correctly and appropriately and to be kept accountable, and the same with the public sector. I think it's absolutely crucial that partnership becomes the key word going forward in terms of corridor institutions or institutional arrangements that call or certainly revolve around cross-border trade. It's got to be about partnership between government and private sector. And that's difficult. I'm not saying it's easy at all, but it's absolutely essential, because you don't get the kind of transparency and accountability without those two role players working together.
Yeah.
And yes, it's difficult, and often the kids fight, but we've got to get it right, because I don't think that's an option. And it's an exciting prospect, I think, to look at new ways of doing things, because I certainly don't think that the way we've always been doing it works.
It's working. Yeah, and Barbara, even as you're saying that the difficulty in terms of government working with private sector, and I feel like there's always that blame each other. Like, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. It's your fault. Like, it's like you're pointing fingers at each other, but you're not solving the issue at hand.
Exactly.
Which makes it complicated. And it's wasting everyone's time, because the issue is still there. The integration is not being done. And again, as you said, we become reluctant. We retract to our own positions. It's like, okay, I'm just going to keep my import tariffs because that's what I know, and I'm getting a lot of money from it, rather than me integrating and bringing that region in. And I think even for small, now I'm looking towards the SMEs who want to export to different African countries. It makes it difficult, because where do they go? Where do they go? How can they leverage on that? And I think there's a lot of opportunities available there. The information is there, but how do they start? How do they get access to that? Yeah.
And I think we've got to commend, certainly, I think, in our revenue authorities. Mozambique has taken on world best practice as far as the single economic window is concerned, electronic window. So that, alongside South Africa's revenue service, which is a trade facilitation mechanism that is very, very advanced, the two should be able to talk to each other because of how far they've come. And, customs modernization has been an old tune in the region. But honestly, if we look at South Africa, at Mozambique and Eswatini, they're all really flagship in terms of customs modernization. So what you're saying is, yes, we do need to have that integration. And it happens at customs level because that's where you find the ability to get traders to comply across a supply chain, not just with one country. And I think we've got to get away from just, this is what we do in our country. It's a full supply chain. If we look at the Maputo Corridor, for example, bulk trade moving on the corridor, most of the bulk is reasonably low risk. So why is it subjected to scanning charges, for example? Is there not a profile where you would, with authorized economic operator program status, you would have compliance across the whole supply chain? So cargo owners, clearing and forwarding agents, transporters, everybody is part of that compliance. And it's across the border. It's not just in one country. And I think that's something that I believe is a huge priority to strengthen regional integration, because if we look at the value that corridors add to economies, we really need to make the most of it. One very sad example, I'm sure that people are aware of the absolute crisis we've had in South Africa over the last month or so. In fact, probably 2 to 3 months. But the Minerals Council of South Africa was saying that during, I think it was 2 weeks ago, there was a 5-day period where traffic was literally standing for 3 to 5 days. And we lost to our economy just in 5 days, 1.5 billion rand in export earnings. You don't get that back. And the impact is significant. So, if I had the ear of the decision makers, I would say, stop looking at the short term, stop looking at your election period. And look at the long term benefit, that if you get these small things right, the benefits to your economy are significant.
It's tremendous. Yeah, thank you, Barbara. And
because I know it can be done.
Yeah, it can, and it will be done.
Yes.
And
with people like you, for sure.
Thank you. And Barbara, we've mentioned about the African Continental Free Trade Area, and I believe that for this to truly work, we need to get our trade corridors right. So can you share some success stories or wonders? It's not all gloomy, I believe. There's something we can learn from them. So what are the success stories that you've experienced that you're like, wow, this was the before and look at how it is right now. So can you share some of them?
Look, I think we've certainly seen the success of the Maputo Corridor, and I think part of the issue that we're dealing with obviously has to do with the capacity of South African ports and so on. And the fact that rail in Africa is in a dire state, and it's not just Southern Africa, it's everywhere. But the port of Maputo and the corridor is actually an incredible success story. What we're seeing at this point is the result of a huge number of factors. But if one looks at the growth that the corridor has seen since 2003, say, when the port concession was awarded to MPDC, they were moving just 4.5 million tons. We're on to 22 million tons in 20 years. Wow. And I think, that together with the huge infrastructure investment, we look at one of the most successful cross-border bilateral PPPs in the track N4 concession. That road has contributed enormously to economic growth. Access for people to healthcare, to education, to everything is facilitated by roads. Roads play an enormous role in economic development. So we've seen all the right things happen on the Maputo Corridor. But I think what we've seen also, what's not working at the moment, isn't to say that it's all doom and gloom. We have never seen the volumes moving through the Maputo Corridor that we're seeing at this present time. Yeah. But the port investment, I think they're over $800 million US at this point into the concession, is significant. And demand is huge. So yeah, I think that's a success story. The fact that you're seeing sometimes 2,000 trucks a day through that border post, where the infrastructure is very limited, is a significant testament to how government agencies are really working to make things more efficient. I believe that we can still be more efficient. We've seen a big drop in the last 5 to 6 weeks because of the various issues. And so we've seen what we can do. There's no doubt in my mind that can continue to just. And I do think it's a success story, despite the fact that we see this terrible congestion that is the case. And I think the sad part is that, basic services from certain of the government agencies is just missing. And as a result, they don't seem to get the big picture. My discussions with traffic authorities that should be doing basic traffic policing and law enforcement is that, well, we don't have the budget. And I say, how can you say you don't have a budget when we're losing 1.5 billion rand in 5 days, but paying extra overtime for law enforcement is not an option, So I think conceptually we've still got a way to go, but it's a good example. I think also the Northern Corridor and Central Corridor have seen huge improvements in their facilities, in their infrastructure. And as a result, I think of the transport observatories that they have. So there's a constant monitoring and evaluation. It's something that's hugely lacking on the Maputo Corridor because the institution is not there.
Yeah.
And that needs to be fixed.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Barbara, for sharing the success story. And it's, as you said, it's a result of so many partners coming together and actually coming and fixing. It's not just like saying that it's your issue, you solve it. They're not saying like, no, you need the money, you need the border to work, so you do it. It's everyone coming together and saying, okay, let's work on it. Let's make it work. It's for our region, it's for our development. And we can see this growing, we can see it growing even to the other provinces in Mozambique. We can see it influencing the other neighboring countries as well. So it's amazing to see that, despite all the challenges, there's still a lot that has been done, and we need to celebrate those achievements, up until now. There's a lot, has been a long journey. So, and
they're right. It's definitely, it can't just be said it's one person or one agency or one department that's done it. It's a collective working together effort, and certainly the case.
Yeah.
I mean, also Beira and Ghana have also seen massive improvements. So there are exciting stories. And I think there's only good news ahead as far as these corridors are concerned.
Exactly. And Barbara, how can we practically get involved in solving the border issue? Is it only the responsibility of the private and public sector, or everyone can join in? Is it how can people actively can we do that? First of all,
but I suppose it's a bit like saying, and it's difficult unless you're a stakeholder. But if you're a community that lives along the corridor, you are a stakeholder. Mm-hmm. And somehow your voice always counts. And I think what's really critical is that quite often in these trade and transport corridors, the community is forgotten.
Yeah.
But they are at the direct receiving end of rows and rows of trucks. They can't get out of their suburbs to get to the city. I mean, Maputo is so blocked by traffic. And I think it's so important that communities raise their voices and speak to their MPs, speak to their governments, to their provincial and city governments to make sure that they add their value to this. And there are forums, I think there are business forums that exist all over the corridor that can take your issues to the departments that really count. And I think it's absolutely critical that everybody realizes that they have a contribution to make. Very, very important.
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara. And just gearing now to the end, what is one of your last comments or word of advice I can say to supply chain professionals or to a company who is not only operating in one country, but they have trucks, they have products that they need to move. What can they do? What's a word of advice, a word of caution, that you can give it to supply chain professionals who are kind of navigating in these corridors?
Look, I think it's really essential that you get the right information. It's so important that you don't, social media is brilliant and terrible because it sensationalizes the wrong things and doesn't say the right things always. I mean, you can't make a blanket statement like that without justifying it. But I do think that supply chain professionals and certainly people who are looking to move goods across borders must get the right information from the right agencies. And where no corridor institution exists, it's really difficult. But that means you've got to really work hard to engage with your customs departments, and most customs agencies do have stakeholder type functions. So that's important. It's important to understand what products will work, what the costs of transport are, what the regulations are. So, all of those things are accessible, especially now that we have the internet. And very important that people are really well informed, because cross-border trade is a risky business and you don't want to put money into something and not get clear. And if you, for example, are moving trucks across borders, that's your investment is in that hardware, and that has to work 24/7 in order to be efficient and sustainable. The other thing I would say, and I mean, this is probably strange advice, but I would strongly recommend that you commit yourself to ethical business practice.
Mm-hmm.
A sort of really a black and white issue. There's no, we will operate ethically. We will not operate without integrity.
Yeah.
We be known as a company that operates with integrity. And I think that's so crucial for sustainability, because we've seen over and over again where companies have really struggled to get themselves established, taken shortcuts, and inevitably have found themselves out of business a few years down the line. And I think, we need to set a new standard. We've got to prove our critics wrong.
Yeah.
We can't be as the most corrupt continent.
Yeah.
I think we've got to change that discussion.
And if we don't start now, it will be a continuous cycle. You'll continue repeating the same mistakes. And I like what you say. Implementing ethical standards from the start. Don't just, sometimes it's easy to implement when everything is good or everything is easy and the platform is there. But now when it is like the push comes to shove, like you need to be ethical regardless. You need to implement these ethical standards and not just doing under the table deals just to get your truck fast dispatched. Because as you said, you can do it now. Okay, you can earn, you can get your goods released, but then down the years, it will come and bite you. It will always come and bite you.
And what you're doing is really ruining it for everybody else.
Yeah.
Because, people say often, I had to pay a bribe. And my retort immediately is, well, was somebody holding a gun to your head? Sometimes that does happen. We're in Africa, let's be real.
Yeah.
But most often, that's not the case. It's a choice you make. You don't have to pay a bribe. Yes, it will be difficult. And yes, officials sometimes can make it very difficult if you don't pay a bribe. But I just think we've got to change this narrative. We've got to, and it starts with us.
Yeah.
There's no thinking as far as integrity is concerned. You are the one responsible. And I think it's absolutely vital when we talk cross-border trade.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. And Barbara, how can you speak a little bit about your company and how people can get in touch with you if they want to talk a little bit more?
I wish I could say I had a website, but I started one. It did not have time to finish it. So I've just depended on my good old cell phone number and on LinkedIn. Yes.
Yes.
I run a consultancy, which is really just me. And quite often I'm working in partnership with other consultants, which I love because I learn so much from them. I'm currently working on a very exciting project with two very seasoned consultants who have made a real impact on the continent. And I just feel like I'm still a beginner. So I'm really excited to work with them. And it's a learning curve all the time. I heard someone play the other day, if someone called you an expert, it means you've stopped learning. And I just want to say, absolutely not. I have to say thank you for that message. I learned something.
Yeah, learning, always learning something new.
Yeah. It's a very exciting and dynamic sector to work in. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity, really.
I agree. So thank you so much, Barbara, for being on YASCP. So thank you guys for listening to the podcast, to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got valuable information from this discussion. And feel free to share this episode. It is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Deezer, and all your favorite streaming platforms. Make sure that you like, subscribe, share it to your peers. And let's take this message abroad, because I believe the African corridors, they're developing, they're thriving, and this message really will go out to everywhere. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.